Well, I think, first of all, in my book, Tears We Cannot Stop, I have a long discussion of Kaepernick because I think what he did was extremely important. There's been a transition in sports from social conscience to social service. So it's easier for an athlete to be seen with a little kid going to the hospital or helping to build a home. But in the 60s and 70s, it was social conscience. How do I make a stand in defense of vulnerable populations and peoples? Hank Aaron speaking out about racism, Jim Brown, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Muhammad Ali. So we celebrated Wilma Rudolph, Althea Gibson. We celebrated those athletes who were taking a stand and who were doing a righteous thing by identifying with the vulnerable people. And I think Colin Kaepernick brought that back. Yeah, he pissed some people off. He engendered some controversy. But what he was really trying to force us to do is to have a conversation about who is American, what gets to count as American, and am I being un-American and against the troops if I take a knee in defense of the people that those troops have been sworn to defend? So he really forced a significant and serious conversation.
Do you feel like that it had real and lasting impact? I know it's hard to quantify that, but I just do, and it's very subjective, but he was so positively polarizing that I feel like it's going to have some lasting eye-opening. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's a great point. Positively polarizing. That's a great point because he forced people to take a stand, to think about it. Well, if a lot of people hadn't even heard the third verse of the anthem, like, wow, is that what it's talking about?
Yeah.
You know, retrieving those slaves and bringing them back. He was forcing us to say, look, you should be understanding of what these people are confronting. And these are people, people say, well, you're a rich guy. That's the point. A rich guy who's making a lot of money is identifying with and transferring some of that wealth to those vulnerable people. So yes, I think it makes a tremendous difference. And I think he had a significant impact for not the least of which he gave light to Black Lives Matter. And he said it's an important movement. Beyond that, he said it's important for people of conscience, I don't care what your color is, to identify with these people, even if you don't ultimately agree with them. And then thirdly, he was suggesting, as some of the support from the veterans indicated, that look, not all veterans think that what he did was a horrible thing. Some of them said, no, we went to war to defend the very right of us to speak. And now that the politics have shifted on 11/9, we see that we're living in a different world. That kind of act of social conscientiousness is even more important right now.
Why do you think so many people, non-minorities, had a problem even after he told them what he was protesting?
Well, I think, Shannon, it's hard for people to understand if they're not of that particular group that's being vulnerable. Like when men hear the word gender, we think, oh, women and so on. No, you're a man. You have a gender too. Yeah. And sometimes that masculinity is toxic. So men don't often see what women have to live with every day. Many white brothers and sisters or people outside the African-American race don't understand this is what it means every day. We can walk down the street, and the greatest privilege of many white Americans is to encounter a police person and not die in the encounter and to live to tell about it. Correct. Many African-American people, you included, you're one of the most handsome, articulate, well-built black men who's ever existed on this planet and one of the fiercest and sharpest and most insightful. On any given day, you could on a side road be subject to the acrimony and the hate of a police force that could snipe you or wipe you out. So this is the kind of stuff we've dealt with, and I think it's extremely important for many white brothers and sisters and others to understand, to be empathetic to the condition, the plight, and predicament of people who have to face this normally. So if you're not living it, you don't understand it. If you're not existing in it, you don't really get what's going on. When we hear a guy like Skip Bayless take stands in defense of, I'm not saying that because I'm sitting here, that's one of the bravest and most courageous things to do as a white brother or sister is to identify with those whose backs are against the wall and to tell others who are in his position, be careful before you make snap judgments about what's going on there.
I praise him every time we have this talk. He doesn't, he takes for granted. He thinks I'm just doing this, but he doesn't know what it means to us in our community to have him to speak, because a lot of people wouldn't. When we first started this show, and I thought, I said, okay, we're going to talk about it. We're going to be done with it. He said, nope, we're talking about it again. And I'm like, Skip, are you sure? You know what, Skip? And I'm going to tell this story, and I haven't even told Doc this. LBJ says something. He says, if you can convince the lowest white American that he's better, he said, he used the term colored. But if you can convince him he's better than the best colored American, you can pick his pockets. He says, but if you give him someone to look down upon, he'll empty his pockets for you. You see, what's happened is that we've pointed an arrow on people that we can look down. Immigrants, They're coming here taking all your jobs. The Muslims, it's them that's coming here or spreading out and terrorizing the world. It's the blacks, because see that great job that you wanted or you want to get to that college, it's because of affirmative action. Skip, I was about 11 years old, and I never told this story before. I shared it with Ethan Thomas last night, who's doing an expose on black athlete and social activism in today's society.
It's good.
I've never shared this story. I was on the playground. I think I was about 10 or 11 years of age. And this white kid said, Shannon, you got a hole in your pants. I knew I had a hole in my pants because I put the pants on. But I didn't have any. And I looked at him. I said, you got a hole in your shirt and your pants. Right. He says, so what? I'm not black.
There it is.
He would rather be poor than the poor.
Right.
But at least he wasn't black.
Well, see, that right there, you've just condensed a whole history of maybe 100 years of African-American thought and progressive insight about this issue. W.E.B. Du Bois, in his book, Black Reconstruction, and other places, talked about the psychic wages of whiteness. At least I'm not a Negro. At least I'm not that bottom feeder. And what's interesting, Martin Luther King Jr. was in jail in Birmingham. And
I love this story.
Right? The white jailers come to him. Dr. King, you're wrong. And Dr. King is, no, I'm not wrong. He says, segregation is right. He said, no, it's not. And then King asks him, now, how much money do you make? And then he tells him, and he says, you need to be out here marching with us because you are so dehumanized. But the point is, the overlords that exploit most of us can continue to do so if it convinces, as LBJ said, that poorest white person that he or she doesn't have more in common with us, but with each other and rich people who are ruling us all. So I think in that sense, what Colin Kaepernick forced us to see, to make us think about more seriously, is the fact that race continues to make a huge difference in America. Class is real as well. And if we begin to really understand how both of those factors work, race makes class hurt more. So when we talk about this last election as a referendum of the white working class, and they need to be paid attention to, imagine the black and brown and red and yellow working classes who are even further indebted, who are even further subject to social distress. So when you think about it, we have more in common as people of color across the range, right? Poor whites, poor blacks, poor Latinos, poor Asian, poor everybody, than rich people of any ilk who continue to control American society. That's what I try to talk about in my book. And those are the kind of issues that, if we're going to be honest, we could lead America in a different path, in a different direction.
Let me just say this, Skip. I've told Skip, and I've shared with Skip, I said protest should be uncomfortable. It should make the people that you're trying to get their attention, it should make them uncomfortable. Right. But also, when you protest, you should be willing to give up life or monetary gains. Right. Am I right, wrong?
Look, Martin Luther King Jr. said, any man who hasn't found something he's willing to die for isn't fit to live. So, or woman in that, for that matter. So yeah, you can't both make the statement, be willing to take the hits, and then complain about how they hurt. The reality is some people are going to have to sacrifice. Some people who make a courageous stand, like Muhammad Ali, sacrifice. How much money did he lose? 3 years. We never saw him really at his height because of his conscientious stand.
We did not.
There will be a sacrifice involved, but if you're real about it and you're committed to it, that sacrifice is real.
I do appreciate what both of you have said about me, and I just hope I can live up to it. But to pursue this a level deeper, and you've been very deep with your eloquence here, but I need your perspective on an issue that's been raised to me by several of my black colleagues over the last couple of months about Colin Kaepernick.
Right.
He took what I viewed as a very solo stand. It was he alone, sort of against the world. And he did something he believed with all his fiber in, to the point that it threatened to cost him his NFL career.
Right.
And yet, I wonder, from both of your perspectives, could he have benefited from early on joining forces with more established and honored black leaders such as yourself, to do so in the way that Jim Brown conducted the Ali Summit that's so famous, the Black Summit back in June of 67, I think it was, when he called upon, obviously, Kareem, Bill Russell, to defend Ali and his conscientious objecting over the Vietnam War, and sort of join forces to provide him with more national impact and sort of early credibility. Would that have helped this protest even more?
That's an interesting point, because he did reach out to me behind the scenes. I didn't want to take any public stance in terms of, or even credit for what he's doing, because what he did was important. Here's the tricky part of that. You know, when I would talk to Jesse Jackson, I said, man, how did you end up getting to work with Martin Luther King Jr.? How rare that was. He said, the line wasn't long, brother. The line wasn't long to die.
To your point, he wasn't that
The
guy.
line wasn't long to die. The line wasn't long to sacrifice. The line wasn't long to give up what you have in order to invest in a people in a long term. So all of these black people who remonstrate against Mr. Kaepernick, where were you? You've got a voice. Why didn't you stand up? Why didn't you join him? Why didn't you say what's going on here is good? You know, because most of us, like any color of people, watch our hides. We're worried about the bottom line. Will it affect us? And I understand that. I'm not saying that you should be oblivious to your brand, but what's even more important is those people who have been branded throughout history as stigmatized and demonized. And what Colin Kaepernick did was to lay it all on the line. And those who were critical of him, I can understand it's not perfect, but then you have the right to join him. You have the right to call him. You have the right as a famous black person or a leader to reach out to him, to forge connections and alliances. And one person can't do it all. That's true. But one person can make such a huge difference. Henry David Thoreau said, there's nothing more powerful than a man who, any man more right than his neighbor is a majority of one. So in that sense, Colin Kaepernick was a majority of one. That small gesture of standing down in the face of the anthem created a furor, to be sure, a firestorm of controversy, but also an awareness that this is a serious issue. I mean, John...
Did he want you to help him publicly or just privately advise?
Yeah, just privately advise. I mean, and look, I don't mind taking a stand. That's what I do. But at the same time, I thought it was very important for Colin Kaepernick to do what he did, to reach out and to forge connections among people. And he put his money where his mouth is. I mean, the man is given $1 million of his the first fruits tithing, so to speak, of his contract. That's even more important and more impressive because beyond the cameras and when the lights are no longer there, he's making substantive contributions to people on the ground, and I think that's extremely important.
Last quick question on this. We went back and forth about this. Should Colin, at his next stop, and it's going to make it a little harder for him to find that next home, should he continue the anthem protest? If the next team says, could you please back off for this next year and just focus on football, should you do it or not?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, look, here's the irony. When you're doing well, then people will tolerate anything, right? I mean, winning is a cure for many sins. If you're not winning, then your social conscience may cost you even more. And I think Colin Kaepernick has to examine himself and say, what's most important? The statement I make, the gesture I make, and I'm going to be consistent if I don't get the job or I do get the job, right? And here's the hypocrisy of many of the people choosing him, though. You know, they have all kinds of beliefs and passions and sentiments that motivate them. To see Colin Kaepernick is the worst American ever and the guy they hate most in the NFL when you've got a league already plagued by violence toward women. You've got a league that's already plagued with indifference toward children. In many instances, and now Colin Kaepernick becomes the bête noir. He becomes the worst thing you can imagine. Shame on them. And not only has he exposed what America has done and been complicit in, he's exposed some of these NFL executives and others who may not have the right sort of conscientiousness when it comes to these issues. But in terms of his own life, he's got to make a choice that's up to him. And I think at this point, he's committed to saying, I got to follow through on what I'm going to do. Let me find a team who will acknowledge that.